morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give it another minute or so to let other people join us. While we're waiting, it would be wonderful for you to open up the chat and let us know where you're joining us from and if you have any personal experience with North American porcupine. Good morning. If you've just joined us, we'll be starting here in just a moment.
Yeah, this is Scott Medeiros, and I'm in Portal, Arizona.
Hi, welcome.
Hi, and no, I have not. The only experience I've had with porcupines in the wild was Africa.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. If you've just joined us, you're welcome to let us know where you're tuning in from this morning. And if you have any fun stories or experience with porcupine, we'd love for you to share that in the chat. Welcome to today's coffee break. This is a topic that I'm personally passionate about. I'm Emily Burns, the program director with Sky Island Alliance. And today it's going to be featuring work of Meagan Bethel, our lead wildlife specialist, who first discovered porcupine on our study cameras and has been learning so much about their activities. So I won't steal any of her thunder, but just some housekeeping for today. If you have any questions for Meagan or comments that you want to share with the group, please feel free to use the chat and enter in whatever you'd like to share. We'll look at that at the end of Meagan's presentation. We can have a question and answer session. And if you have any stories you want to share out loud, you're welcome to. We will ask you to stay muted during Meagan's presentation. But then when we get to the Q&A, you're welcome to just jump in and speak up if you'd like to share. The Sky Island Alliance office and my house, where I'm speaking to you from here in Tucson, is on Indigenous land. We work on both sides of the border on Native land, and specifically here in Tucson, we're on the home of the Tohono O'odham and the Pascua Yaqui and other Indigenous people. Porcupine are such a fascinating species, and I know I'm going to learn a lot from Meagan this morning. My own experience with porcupine was once I was doing backpacking in the southern Sierra Nevada mountains, and all of a sudden I heard this crunching sound and looked over to the side, and there was this massive yellow spiky animal kind of thundering through the pine trees, and it was a really special moment. It was quiet except for the rustle of the porcupine going by. So Meagan's going to talk to you about our study that includes a lot of observations of porcupine. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Meagan. Meagan, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that lovely introduction. And I have yet to see a porcupine on the ground, but I'm sure that's really exciting. So yeah, everyone, thank you for joining today. As Emily alluded to, I'm going to be talking about our detections of porcupine in our study area, which is in and around the San Rafael Valley. But to begin, I just want to give a brief overview of North American porcupine. That's their full common name. Rhythizon dorsatum. Porcupines are the second largest rodent in North America. The beaver's larger, but the porcupine has a lot of quills, which makes it look a lot puffier than the beaver. It's a generalist herbivore, which means it eats about anything that's a plant matter. So bark, leaves, stems, eats about anything, just about anything. It's arboreal as well as ground dwelling. So that means it lives up high in the trees, which you might typically think of porcupines being, high up in a conifer or a cottonwood, but they're also on their ground dwelling. They can live in burrows and are commonly found in grasslands. And they're highly adaptable. They range across North America, all the way from Canada down through Mexico. And typically you associate them with trees and forests, but they are found in deserts, grasslands, and even some suburban areas like Albuquerque. And we'll look at that a little closely in a little bit. Some more biology. Their breeding season is October through November. Keep that in mind as we talk more about our sightings in the Sky Islands. And one kind of fun fact, they can live up to 18 years in the wild. That's like the maximum, but that's still really old for a rodent. So that's just something that's really neat that these animals can exist on the landscape for that long. They're both solitary and territorial. So that means that they'll have a single home range and they'll defend it from any other porcupines outside of breeding season and when they raise their young. And both males and females defend their territories. However, those home ranges are not very large, especially for such a big animal and a herbivore. It's about, for males, it's about 50 to 32 acres. And for females, it's about 19 acres around. And here is that area laid over the University of Arizona campus, if you're familiar. I feel like that gives good sense of scale. A female could live basically in the football stadium if she wanted to. However, when you put it over a landscape like a grassland, it doesn't feel that big at all. So essentially, if you've been in the Sky Islands, it takes a long time to get across the landscape. And these animals do inhabit a pretty small little square of each area. They might only have like 3 or 4 trees in this grassland habitat. So going back to that distribution map, this is from iNaturalist, and all these little squares are records of porcupine that people have submitted. iNaturalist is a great community resource of collecting sightings and information. And the darker red are areas that have a hotspot of porcupines where people see them a lot and submit them a lot. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then over here is the kind of Texas cities in central Texas. But you can see they range all the way up to Canada. There is a gap in the south, but they are pretty common in the northeast. But today we're going to focus on this very southwestern extent of their range, which is the Sky Island region. So a bit of context of porcupines in southern Arizona to start. There are scattered records of porcupines going back to like 1918. There's been a lot of historical records saying like, oh, there's been one maybe in the Chiricahuas. There's been a few sightings in different mountain ranges in actually outside of Tucson too, like in 1934. They are found in most plant communities based on previous surveys, but they tend to avoid the mountains, which is curious because you typically would think of porcupines being in a arboreal forest species, like you think in Flagstaff, or in the northern Arizona, they are very commonly found in those colder tree areas. And like kind of subverting that trope, they are commonly found in grasslands and semi-desert scrub. So that means the grasses of kind of the Sonoyta area, and then the desert of kind of like more southeastern Arizona. And based on all these past research, they're just understudied and they're not very understood. There's a lot of research on the porcupine outside of Arizona, like in California, Portland, and even in the East Coast, but there's just not a lot of information about their habits and where they occur in Arizona. And all those papers said, well, they're super uncommon. We've seen them once in like a couple decades. And if you ask anyone on the street, people just don't realize there's porcupines in the Southwest. I call them unicorns almost, because if you hear about a record of one, everyone gets really excited. Oh, I didn't know they were here. However, the situation for porcupines in northern Mexico is even more interesting. There is a population of porcupines near Llanos in Chihuahua, the state of Chihuahua. And on this map, this big yellow star is about where those records are. And if you go on iNaturalist, you can see those observations. And there have been 2 other sightings near Cananea, this little star here near the border. And there's also one way south near Hermosillo, which is pretty far south for their range, but it was a photo of unfortunately, it was a mortality of a dead porcupine, but Those quills are pretty distinctive. However, those are really it for porcupines in Sonora, and they are listed as endangered officially in Mexico. And that's opposed to the least concern in the US and the rest of in Canada. But they're endangered in Mexico because it is the very southern part of their range, in addition to loss of habitat due to riparian tree logging for like cottonwoods and just overgrazing by cattle. And there's been some reports that they are being exterminated because they're seen as pests. And there was one quote that they're dangerous to ranch dogs. But that's a common thing you'll hear about porcupines across their range, is that they're rodents, they like to eat wood. That's usually why they're taken out. But that is something that's really fascinating to keep in mind, is that they are endangered in Sonora, and the fact that there's porcupines in the Southwest and Arizona too is critical for maintaining these populations south of the border as well. This is a really cute picture of one in a tree near Llanos. So this leads us now to Sky Island Alliance's Border Wildlife Study. And that's our large-scale wildlife camera grid that's been going since March of 2020. Our cameras are still out there recording the biodiversity of wildlife in and along the U.S. Mexico border in southern Arizona. And it's a systematic grid of cameras spaced 2 kilometers apart. And from actually I don't have a map, but it reaches from the Patagonia Mountains through the San Rafael Valley to the eastern slopes of the Huachuca Mountains. And so far, we've gotten over 6 million photos. We've seen a ton of biodiversity and beautiful animals, but most of them are what we expect: coyotes, bobcats, mountain lions, pronghorn in the grasslands. And it just shows how biodiverse and wonderful this region is. However, it's kind of a spoiler, but in 2020, June 2020, we got this one photo. And for a couple months, we were like, what is this animal? I have looked at wildlife photos for over 10 years, and I didn't know what this creature was. We thought, could it be a javelina? It didn't look like a badger. So we sent it to experts, and they're like, well, it could be a porcupine. But at that point in 2020, we didn't, the idea of porcupines in this valley was unheard of. Like there was no records of them, or at least on publicly accessible. So we're like, well, maybe not. But then in July of 2020, that same year, we got this picture. And that's undisputably a porcupine butt walking away from the camera. You can see that kind of salt and pepper static color that is the quills, and that black fuzz is the long guard hairs. And that made us go back to that first photo and think, I think that's a porcupine. And then third time's a charm. This is a separate Sky Island camera, not part of that grid system, but it's near Parker Canyon Lake, and this is definitely a porcupine. And we're like, oh my gosh, there's a porcupine here in the landscape, but it's like a unicorn. We didn't think that we would show up too much. But since then, we've gotten more and more pictures of porcupine, which is really fun. So far, since March of 2020 to May of 2024 of this year, we've gotten 127 independent records of porcupine on our Border Wildlife Study cameras, which is like a windfall of photos of an animal we never expected here in this region. And we've had them during the day. And we've also had some field sightings when we were checking our cameras. We looked up and we're like, what? There's a porcupine right above us. You can see that one the top right corner is a field sighting. So here's just some more information about our porcupine detections over time. And we call detection a unique record in like 30 minutes. So our cameras take photos whenever something moves. And there could be a porcupine in front of that camera for like 15 minutes and we get like 30 pictures. But we'll consider that just one independent detection because it's the same animal. So just a bit of context of what detections mean. But here you can see, here's the start of the study on the left, and going across time, we have each month going through the years of our study. And there's weird trends. I'm not entirely sure yet why there's peaks and then why there's no porcupine detections. Our cameras tell us a lot, but for an animal that's pretty solitary and nocturnal, it's hard to get more information about where these porcupines are going. I'd love to get like collar information on these animals, but oh well. But some interesting things is that in January of 22, and then like August, September of 23, we have a spike of porcupine detections. And that's outside of that typical breeding range, October through November. It's kind of on the outskirts or borderlines, but doesn't seem to match that published research. Maybe they might have a different breeding season here in the Southwest because of the monsoons or the temperature differences. I feel like with these discoveries, there's always more questions to ask, and there's certainly a lot more to tease out. So then let's look at our detections on the landscape. So just a little context here, this little red box is what we're looking at. And that's our border wildlife study. Here are the Patagonia Mountains. Here's the town of Patagonia, going across the San Rafael Valley. And here are the Huachuca Mountains. And over here is Sierra Vista off the edge of the map. Each little black dot is one of our cameras, and a blue dot indicates where we've detected a porcupine. And the size of the dot is how many detections on that one site. And so you can see most of them are clustered in the central San Rafael Valley. We have a couple detections elsewhere, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it really does seem this San Rafael Valley, and here are the headwaters of the Santa Cruz River as it goes south into Mexico. And something about that region, the porcupines really like. So 125 of our detections was in Great Plains and Great Basin grasslands. That's a plant community. And this is a photo of what that typically looks like. If you've been into the San Rafael, it's a rolling natural grassland with sprinkled with cottonwoods. And this is where most of our porcupines have been detected on our cameras, which is very different than those ponderosa pine forests you might typically think of porcupines being in the rest of the country. However, we did get one detection of a porcupine in semi-desert grassland, which there have been historical records of porcupine in this landscape and plant community, but we've gotten one, and it hasn't shown up since. Who knows where he went? And this is kind of typical. It's that grassland scattered with ocotillo, prickly pear, and other cactus. And we did get one porcupine in the what we consider the Madrean evergreen woodland. This is the most classic plant community we think of in the Sky Islands. It's those beautiful oaks. However, there's not many porcupines in this habitat. And there's hypothesis that in the Sky Island region, they don't go high up in elevation because of mountain lions and bears, which are a predominant predator of porcupine. So maybe they are staying lower in elevation just to avoid predation risk, which makes sense. Not a lot of things will take on a porcupine, but if you're mountain lion, you're big enough. You don't worry about those quills. But you'd think a porcupine would like these trees, but something is keeping them out of those higher elevations. A little bit more detail. This image is overwhelming, but I'll walk you through it. The most important part is to look at that yellow color. That yellow is the grassland, and this is a study done by our Round River conservation students a couple years ago. And they collect the plant community and cover type in each of our camera locations. And the yellow is the amount of grassland at each site, or the grass cover at each site. So here you can see most of the blue dots are centered around areas that have a lot of yellow, which means a lot of grass cover. And here are those one-off porcupines. The one in the semi-desert still has a lot of grass in that location. And then here's the one in the Madrean woodland, which still has cover, but there is open ground. So this is a little bit more details about what plants these animals seem to be favoring. However, one thing that was in common with all detections is that they were all in what we consider a dry wash or a riparian area. As I mentioned, the Santa Cruz River starts in the San Rafael Valley, and there's a lot of drainages and washes in around that area where these porcupines are frequently. And here you can see my coworker Brian, he's surveying for porcupines, looking into Mexico with his little binoculars. The best time to go look for porcupines is in the winter. You go when the cottonwoods don't have leaves, and that way you can see them pretty easily. In the summer, it's kind of tricky. However, then one really fascinating thing about our detections is that we do have cameras along the border road itself, and they've also detected porcupines crossing the U.S. Mexico border. These cameras are part of a slightly different sub-study looking at animal passage rates across different border types. And we've gotten 13 detections of porcupine crossing the international border. And the border we're looking at is this kind of vehicle Normandy barrier. It's made of old railroad ties stacked together in a barbed wire fence. And this is meant to stop cars driving to and fro across the international border. And here's the fun part, we get to watch videos. This is an adult porcupine crossing north back into the US. It crosses that barbed wire. It's easily able to head north to where it's going. And here's a uncommon daytime video. As I said, porcupines are nocturnal. They're usually out at night, but if there's not a lot of human presence or disturbance, they can come out during the day. This one was at around 9 a.m. in the morning. And you can see that really nice yellow color on that guy too. And this is one of my favorite videos, period. It shows a javelina herd investigating something that isn't quite a javelina. And he doesn't really know what to do with it, but smartly leaves it alone. So that is a porcupine off to the left. And I don't know if the javelina was gonna fight it or if it thought it was another javelina. They do kind of are spiky like each other, but it's just a really fun little interaction. And is the benefit of having cameras out. You would never have seen this probably in person. So a little snapshot into the borderland life. It's just too funny. Porcupines seems unbothered, so that's good. And then one really exciting thing is this little video. This is a baby porcupine, and the official term is a porcupet. So this little porcupet investigating the bollard. It's a short video, so I'll play it again. And you can kind of tell it's smaller. It doesn't have the really noticeable spikes. It does have some spines, but it's just super cute. And after seeing this video, I did go back to our photos, and I was like, oh, there are juvenile porcupines on our cameras. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes with scale, but it does confirm that there is a breeding population of porcupine in this valley, which is a big deal because we went from knowing nothing and had no idea they were there to then having juveniles. However, this area is not pristine, and there is threat of border wall, as we all know. Here's a map of the Borderlands region. The red is the pedestrian barrier, which are these tall steel bollards, and the blue is that vehicle barrier, which we saw the porcupines passing through. We have cameras along other sections of the border wall at these bollards, and we have not seen porcupines. Doesn't mean they're not there, but we have not detected them. And so we don't know if they'd be able to cross through these gaps. And based on how large they are, I would assume that they would have a hard time passing through the border wall gaps. And so it's really important to maintain this San Rafael Valley and the passage across this landscape. Here is a photo of the San Rafael Valley looking south into Mexico. And this little line, that's the vehicle barrier border wall. And it's still permeable to animals at this stage. Deer can pass through, the porcupine can pass through. And maintaining this connectivity for all animals, including the porcupine, is really important for the gene flow. And if you remember, the populations in Sonora are listed as endangered. And if we cut off these valleys, who knows where, I don't think porcupines are going to last in the next couple hundred years in Mexico. So the takeaway points is, first of all, there's still so much to learn about these animals. This is mostly an observational presentation showing that we have porcupines, and it shows the benefits of having a long-term camera study on the landscape. We started the study in May of 2020. It wasn't until June, March of 2020. It wasn't until June we got a porcupine, maybe. But you could see, if you remember that graph going over time, you can go months without seeing a porcupine and then all of a sudden have an influx. And so it's nice to have that. If you can have that support and have that framework of cameras, you can learn a lot more about the animals on a landscape. And most importantly, it confirms the presence of porcupines in the San Rafael Valley. And doesn't mean to say that they haven't been there for hundreds of years, or they could be a new population, but there is not a lot of information. So if you do know any landowners in that region or have known families who said, like, oh, of course there's been porcupines here, I'd love to hear that information, because essentially for these understudied animals, we need those stories, we need those records to show that they are around. And also our data does support the hypothesis that they are more in the grasslands in riparian areas of southern Arizona. So if you are in those areas hiking or birding, if you happen to see a lump in the cottonwoods that isn't a bird nest, do pay attention to it, because it could be a porcupine. And it does confirm their passage across the U.S. Mexico border, which further supports our efforts to protect the connectivity across the landscape and the future of their conservation in Sonora and Chihuahua. And so I mentioned, if you see a porcupine in the landscape, the biggest thing is to share it. In the US, they are listed as least concern, so there's not as much of an issue of sharing that information. So if you see one in person and get a photo of it, like in a tree, share it to iNaturalist. That'll be added to that little grid map, and you can shield the location to protect the exact coordinates. But that helps other biologists, other researchers learn, or me, I'll keep an eye on that map, of where these porcupines are being seen. And if you do have a wildlife camera out, collecting photos or videos, and you get a porcupine on your camera, do check out Sky Island Photo Fauna if you're not already a part of it. You can submit a monthly checklist of photos you've detected over a month. And if you get a porcupine, I don't know if we've gotten a porcupine yet on our checklist, so you could be one of the first. But all this information is vital for landowners and conservationists that protect these animals. Also, I just love to hear porcupine stories, so you're always welcome to reach out to me, Meagan at skyonalliance.org. And I love to hear. So if you've seen a porcupine, let's talk about it. And that's it for me.
Awesome, Meagan. Well, this was just so interesting, and we all love seeing the photos and the videos and knowing that there's a stronghold for porcupine down there in the San Rafael. Just because you were talking about observations, I was wondering if maybe you could share a little bit about sort of the track and sign that people could look for, other evidence that porcupines might be around if people think they're in porcupine habitat.
I'm going to jump back to this photo here at the beginning of my presentation. This is a picture of me holding quills. I don't have pictures on hand, but if you see a tree like a cottonwood or a fruit tree, you suspect there might be porcupines in the area. Look at the base of the ground. They're pretty messy animals. They shed their quills just like how we shed hair. And if you look carefully and dig through stems and leaves, you can, if you know there's a porcupine around, you can start finding these quills. Also, their scat looks like little commas, like big rat poop essentially, but it's like the size of your, like, it's part of your thumb. We do have some, I can always share pictures and signs if anyone is interested in tracking porcupine. And like my colleague Brian Lichtenhan, he's an expert in tracking, and he helped me find this porcupine tree where we were able to see an actual porcupine in it, because based on the scat, and then we found quills on the ground. So do pay attention, because these animals blend in really well to trees. It's surprising how well they blend in, and you never know where you might see it. So jumping back to this picture, this is a porcupine we saw in a cottonwood. I think it was this cottonwood here. You'd look past it unless you were looking for those signs. So just keep your eyes open.
And the scat looks to me almost like large peanuts or kidney beans or something, and they're kind of reddish orange, right? They've got sort of a
Yeah, it's a rodent. So if you think of like it's a giant a giant rodent poop. So it's pretty unique.
we've definitely spent some time just looking for porcupine poop. So it's very exciting. Well, there've been some great comments and things in the chat. And Catherine shared at the beginning that she actually woke up and had a porcupine on her stomach.
Oh,
Catherine, do you want to unmute and share a little bit more
yeah.
about that?
Yeah, it was really fun. I was on the Adirondack Trail doing some maintenance work and sleeping in one of the shelters. And I woke up because I felt something really heavy on my stomach. And I could tell it was an animal. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was a skunk or what. So I had my friend next to me turn on her flashlight, and darned if it wasn't a porcupine. It eventually just crawled off and went away, but I don't know. It probably thought it was a nice soft place to sleep on my stomach.
Yeah, nice and warm. That's fantastic. And just to give everyone some context, even though they are very prickly, they're pretty harmless animals. So just don't bother them, especially if you wake up with on your stomach. That's certainly unique. It's great.
And I just posted a link to a blog that was written by one of our great volunteers, Alicia, after the great porcupine search with Megan and Brian down there a couple years ago. And there's a picture of what the scat actually looks like. So check that out. There's a comment from, oh, Brian. Brian is here and he has a little bit more to say about porcupine scat. Please, Brian, we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, everybody. I saw some people asking about seeing the sign and scat, and definitely check out that blog. I do have some porcupine scat with me right here. So for folks who are interested, and yeah, they do kind of remind me of like peanuts in the shell, maybe, but a little smaller. So yeah. And then there was a question too about like chewed bark sign and twigs. So this is an example of a twig that was chewed by a porcupine and found under the tree with that scat and quills and stuff like that. So those are some things to keep your eyes peeled for. And again, yeah, the scat can be longer, shorter, and sometimes they're even like segmented or like connected to each other, like little sausage links. So anyway.
And one thing,
all.
thank you, Brian. One thing to keep in mind too is that if you think of their home range, it's not that big. So if you have some time to spare and you see those signs on the ground, do a walk of the perimeter of that area, and you probably find it.
Mm-hmm. So there's a comment from Trisha about just how fascinating it is that porcupine are in the grassland when they would seemingly be so visual to their predators like mountain lions. So it seems almost counterintuitive because of that, they're almost more vulnerable in the grasslands, which is interesting.
Yeah. I do kind of comment on that for a second.
Yeah.
Based on our observations on our cameras, there's not a lot of mountain lions in the grasslands. So that might just be why. There's just not a lot of animals. And then the predators that are there, coyotes, bobcats, they have to work pretty hard to get a porcupine.
Sure. Well, one of the things I was thinking after you put this diagram up showing what a hypothetical range would be for both females and males is it'd be sort of interesting to better understand maybe that's their footprint, but it's shifting over time. I can imagine they, exploit all of the young tasty branches in a tree over time. If they kept at it, they might do the tree in. So I wonder if there is sort of a rotation, and that explains why we get these gaps, some seasonal gaps where they disappear off our cameras that aren't moving, right?
Yeah, that's a great hypothesis because all the home range studies have been done in like conifer forests, or further north where there's a lot higher density of porcupine and habitat. So I could see them having to move just based on resources, being a little less territorial almost with it.
Mm-hmm. Dinah has chimed in to ask if we've talked to the Sharp family, who has a large ranch in the San Rafael Valley for multiple generations.
I have
So-
not yet, but my next steps is to reach out to the landowners, like with the like a letter, and maybe an email asking, have you seen porcupines? And that, because those are the people to ask for sure.
Mm-hmm. There's a question, a clarification question about the porcupines in the Southwest. Is just, I guess, maybe saying a little bit more about where else they're known to be in the Southwest.
Yeah, there are some great studies that are publicly accessible on the internet about previous research that's been done. Usually they're surveys of other landowners and agencies. And I did not research much into like the Texas populations in New Mexico, just because there are a little bit higher abundance. But they are also seen in that kind of same grassland riparian habitat across the Southwest of the US. And Llanos, Chihuahua is another one of those kind of riparian areas. So it seems to be the same in this region.
Gotcha. And then a question back to the scat of porcupine. Does the scat have sawdust looking materials in it from the wood fiber in their diet, like beaver scat? Question for you or to Brian.
Brian, do you want to chime in since you have it on hand?
Sure, yeah. Yes, it definitely looks like kind of compressed wood chips, very fine sawdust. Yeah.
Okay, great. I misread one of the questions. So could you say anything about what's known, why there's a big absence of porcupine in the Southeast? So clearly in the Southwest, I misread. Why are they not in the Southeast?
I have to admit, I did not do a ton of research into why until I looked at this map. I'm like, oh, there's a big gap. I don't want to misquote anything, but I'm assuming that they were extirpated from that region due to logging and deforestation. I'd have to go back and look at historical records to see if they were present.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation and something we can look into more. Do you have any ideas about how porcupines impact their environment, either their ecological role or anything more broad about their presence on the landscape?
Yeah, in the Southwest, they really don't pose much of a issue, but there's lots of papers and articles about porcupines further north in the country, especially in timber habitat. They do eat and take debark trees, which could be an issue. And I've had lots of stories of them eating like shovel handles and anything wood because of the salt. So that is one thing to keep in mind, that they are eroded and they will eat salts and wood and vegetation. Fortunately though, in the Southwest, they really aren't much of a pest, quote unquote. I don't like that term, but for economic reasons, the biggest thing would just be aware of your dogs if you're camping. That would be probably the biggest concern. One fun, maybe not fun fact, but if you hit a porcupine quill on the road and it hits your sidewall of your tire, it could cause a flat. So porcupine mortalities is really high on roads. So just do be aware, save your porcupine and the tire. So
yeah. They're definitely considered in coastal forests. I used to work in the redwood forest, and the timber companies really don't like them because they'll go up to the tops of redwoods and they'll girdle the tree. They'll go after that really sugary cambium up at the upper crowns and eat that. And then of course that really prevents normal timber development. So yeah, not beloved by all, but we certainly love them down here. Great. Any other questions that I may have missed in the chat that you want to jump on and ask, or any stories anyone else wants to share? Okay, great. Well, you're welcome to contact Meagan directly, especially if you have any observations or you hear about someone who might have more porcupine data. Meagan is pulling together a research note on this for publication. And so there's lots of opportunities for us to really expand our understanding of these species going forward. Thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to talk about the amazing biodiversity of the region. And today may be the beginning of the chance of rain going up in our area. We feel like monsoon may be coming here, which is would be a very welcome change. So think good thoughts for rain in the Sky Island region, and may the rain fall on you wherever you are. Thanks, Meagan, for such a great presentation.
Thank you.